you wait and see. Tomorrow just you wait and see. We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day. Keep smiling through, just like you always do, till the blue skies drive the dark clouds far away. So won't you please say hello to the folks that I know, tell them I won't be long. They'll be happy to know that it's you saw me go. I was singing this song. We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day. Yes, I know we'll meet again some sunny day.
When you look back on human history, our story can be defined by its highest and lowest moments. Moments of love, moments of courage, moments of brilliance, most often, moments of darkness. And among those darkest chapters in our existence, one word appears again and again. Short, sharp, and drenched in innocent blood. War. 3 letters that should send shudders down our spines. Because war is not just a word. It is a splinter in humanity. A declaration of failure. A representation of our deepest evils. Greed, ego, hatred, and the illusion that some lives are worth less than others. It has shaped nations, erased cities, and rewritten lives. And far too often, war has not just stained the past, it has defined it.
The people answered, "Fire!
In 1914, a single bullet in Sarajevo set the world ablaze. Alliances collapsed, empires clashed, and the First World War began. A war so vast and brutal, it was called the War to End All Wars. Within days of the conflict commencing, Canada joined the fight. And soon, from coast to coast, young men left fishing boats, factories, and farms to serve a cause they barely understood. Changed forever and scarred for eternity. Some eventually returned. But far too many never returned at all. Countless brave souls gave up their tomorrow so that we could have our today. The question that each and every one of us must answer is this: do we live in a way that truly honors their sacrifice? Cumberland County is a small rural community in Nova Scotia, some 5,000 kilometers from the battlegrounds, yet its innocent residents could not help but become collateral damage. War came quietly to this peaceful, humble, hard-working region. It arrived through telegrams, train stations, and tear-stained letters. Its impact, however, was as loud and lasting as gunfire on the Western Front. This film tells 5 stories of people from this community. 5 individuals, 5 lives, but they are not totally unique. They are us. They represent us. They call to us. These 5 stories represent very similar stories for millions. Millions who looked like them, lived like them, and suffered just as they did. These are not just stories of the past. They are reflections, warnings, and echoes from the inferno that we don't ever want repeated again. This film was created as a time capsule to capture these stories before they disappear from living memory forever. To show what war really does, not to borders, but to people. To give respect and a voice to those who lived and those who made the ultimate sacrifice so that we could all live in peace. Our stories start in Amherst, Nova Scotia in 1916, when a young man named Will R. Bird was attempting to enlist in the war effort.
Will R. Bird was born just outside of Amherst, and when the First World War came along, he wanted to enlist. But unfortunately for Will, he had been playing hockey and his teeth were broken. And so when he went to enlist, they looked at him and said, no, sorry, we can't take you in. I imagine that's because they didn't want to spend the time and expense to fix his teeth. So they rejected him. He still had that urge, that desire to join the war, as many young men did in those days. So he went again to try and get in. And this time he went to the same regiment where his brother was in. He thought, well, I'll serve with my brother. But again, he was rejected. And he found out later that it was his brother who had talked to the recruiting officer and said, no, he has to stay home, with my mother. I don't want him there. And so he was quite upset about that. And then he went out west to work. And he thought, okay, I'm out west, I'll try again. And so he did, but again, he was rejected. 1916, they needed more men. So he was enlisted and accepted in 1916. Bert was one of those people who liked to record, liked to write things down. So he actually kept 3 diaries, and he talked a lot about the mud. Unfortunately, the rats were quite fat, and I imagine you can realize why they were fat. And the rain, the trenches, and the gas, and the snipers, all the different things that you faced on a daily basis. He tells a story I think is very key to this whole experience. There was a young man who came to his first day in the trenches, and he was talking to the sergeant, and he said to the sergeant, "How long have you been here?" And the sergeant said, "I've been here 18 months. So the young man said, "Well, I guess I'm good for a while then." And that was when he got hit in the head with a stray bullet, and he died on his first day. I think the overwhelming reality that these people face, that you didn't know when that bullet was coming. You didn't know when the mud would get you, when the gas would get you, when the rats would get you. It was a horrendous experience that they lived through. Well, Will R. Bird ended up in France after his training and enlistment. One day he was with his comrades, and a man named Freddie said, "I had a really strange dream. I dreamt that a woman in white came into the tent, and she was silent, but she pointed at you and you, and she pointed at me," said Freddie. "And I don't think I'm going to make it back to Canada." And later on in the war, Will R. Bird found out that some of the men, Big Herman, Freddie himself, Mickey, and a couple others, they didn't make it back. They were killed in France. Well, Bird lost many close friends and many comrades. Actually, it's a very common experience for the soldiers who survive a war to have lost a comrade right beside you, to have had that experience where your best friend's beside you and he's killed and you're not. That happened with Bird a couple of times, and so he lost a number of very good friends. In actual numbers, Canada lost over 60,000 men in the First World War. Another 172,000 were injured. So when you look at the number of Canadians who enlisted, that's close to a third. Close to a third were either dead or wounded, and many came back broken in mind and body. Byrd wrote a number of books about the war and about war stories. The first one was called And We Go On. That whole concept of you come through those horrible experiences, but you're still alive. So you go on. But how do you go on? Those who survived the war are on a ship coming back to Halifax. And it's not what you would expect. It's not a party ship. Everyone is silent. No one's really talking. And Byrd goes up on the deck, and many of them aren't sleeping. It's the middle of the night, but they're up watching the water and staring. And you can tell by what he's talking about. He's talking about what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but they didn't have a name for that back in 1930, back in 1919. And he looks at the men and he realizes that how are we going to tell our family about what we experienced? People are going to ask us questions. People are going to say, what was it like? And we're really prisoners, in a sense, prisoners of our experience. We're not going to be able to tell them what we went through because they won't understand, they won't get it. And then he started thinking about it, and he realized that some of the men he was looking at were very moody. We're going to turn to alcohol. We're going to become drifters, trying to escape the memories, come back in your sleep, but those memories you can't escape from. So he realized that he wasn't going to be able to tell the true story, the actual events, and have people understand. He could tell them, but would people understand? So he became a writer, tried to convey the whole feeling of the barbed wire and the mud and the rain and all the horrible experiences that he had. It's important to tell stories before those stories are lost. Last year I did a production called We Remember, where we looked at the diaries and letters of people who had been in World War I and World War II. If they were soldiers, sailors, if they were families waiting at home, war brides, they were common everyday people. And I think that the important thing to do is, if you want to look at what the effect of war on people, you have to look at the effect on the common people. And I think it's important that everyone looks at how war affects the everyday person. And the way to do that is to look at their real stories, look at their diaries, talk to their relatives, and we get the true picture, the true effect of war on the average person.
Will R. Byrd's journey to the trenches was not the only one that began with rejection. Another young man was trying to enlist. Like Byrd, he too was determined to serve. But unlike Byrd, this young man's barriers were not physical. They were much more sinister and a reflection of the plague of this era's mentality. Two different men with so much in common. Another member of the Cumberland community. Another young man shaped by conflict. Another life changed forever. For Wilfred Jones Davidson, his local church was not only his place of worship, but it also became the place where he was recruited for war. A war where his help was not immediately welcomed.
Basically, the church community I refer to as the Highland AME Church was the Highland African Methodist Episcopal Church. It's been in the Amherst area, or was in the Amherst area, since approximately 1872. And it was a church essentially for the black community. It had white members, but it was essentially for the black community. And it was an American-based church located on Poplar Street in Amherst until early 1970s when a new church was built in Upper Church Street. In the context of our family, we're very proud the fact that my great uncle, Wilfred Jones Davidson, Reverend Wilfred Jones Davidson, he was what I from all records I'm able to determine, the first Canadian minister, because there's only been, in the history of that church, 3, to my knowledge, Canadian ministers. All the other ministers were American ministers. So we're very proud of him, and we're also very proud of him in the fact that he was a member of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. The No. 2 Construction Battalion was essentially established in 1916, well after the commencement of the First World War. A number of persons of African descent had attempted to get into the military and were denied strictly because of the color of the skin. There were some that were able to do so. However, the majority were unable to do so. In the terms of my great uncle, it's very interesting that he applied for the 64th Battalion in February 1916, and he was denied, being medically unfit because he was undersized and had deficient eyesight. Now, ironically, in August of 1916, he reapplied, and he was amazingly and suddenly medically fit. No change to the eyesight, and he, according to the records, the military records, was only 2 pounds heavier. If we put it in the context of the No. 2 Construction Battalion, at the time he originally applied, the official comments that were coming back from the military and government officials was, it was a white man's war. We don't want to have a checkerboard army. It would be inappropriate to have white soldiers associating with black soldiers during the war, and even we'll call you when we need you. Ironically, as the war went on, they did need the additional assistance, and that helped with the creation of the No. 2 Construction Battalion, which the decision was made in July of 1916 to create the No. 2 Construction Battalion, hence the medically fit. Even though we have medical officials making these determinations, it showed the complicity essentially between the medical profession and with the military to reinforce racism at the time. That was the difference, because in July, recruitment throughout Canada, and specifically in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, was very, very heavy. And in Amherst itself, there was a huge recruitment process for the persons of African descent. Ironically, again, that recruitment activity took place at the Highland AME Church on Poplar Street. The No. 2 Construction Battalion, when it was formed, a number of individuals wanted to get to the front. They wanted to fight for their country, and they fought the government, they fought the military in order to go fight. Essentially, what it ended up being is that the individuals in the No. 2 Construction Battalion, when they were deployed, in the case of my great uncle, he sailed on February 1917. They sailed on the SS Southland to Britain, and they were deployed to the Jura, I believe that's the correct pronunciation, Jura, mountains near Switzerland, but in France. And they were largely responsible for forestry, lumber operations. They were working in the mills. They were processing lumber, essentially, that could be used for the military effort that was taking place in the front. They were also responsible for maintenance of the water supply to a different units. It was strictly labor work that they were involved in as the No. 2 Construction Battalion, but it was very, very essential to the work and the war effort. And in fact, the Forestry Corps that they were attached to, when the No. 2 Construction Battalion, they doubled the output. The lumber was largely used for trenches, as well as for the base for the railroad that was being created in order to move supplies to the front. Well, when they went to enlist, they were essentially given their uniforms, and there's no guns, there's no weapons, there's no bullets. They were given shovels, they were given picks, they were given saws, they were given all the tools to do the manual labor. Their job was not as one to engage with directly with the enemy. It was more a supportive role. But nevertheless, it was still an essential role. The ironic thing is, There's a number of accounts, both through newspaper and various accounts through a diary of Reverend White, who was the only officer in the No. 2 Construction Battalion, where individuals wanted to engage, they wanted to participate in the front, but they were denied. I haven't found any evidence of people being annoyed or upset. I think a lot of individuals, from the information that I've been able to ascertain, were just very happy to be part of the war effort. And it was essential. I don't think it should be minimized, their role. It was very, very essential to the war effort. He was born, I believe, he was born in 1898. In fact, there's two dates on his records, one for 1897, one for 1898. And quite frankly, I can understand that because we're sitting here in the armories, and when I applied for the militia, I said I was 16 years of age, but I was actually 15. It was a common feature to happen with the military, even in my own case, and I wouldn't be surprised if that was part of the reason. I hadn't really done the math on it, but if you go 2, 16, 18, maybe you had to be 18, I'm not sure of that. 1897 would have done it, 1898 might not have done it. After he had returned, he was ordained as a minister, gave up his carpentry work and leadership with the Boy Scout movement, and he married a woman from Windsor, the Windsor area of Nova Scotia. She unfortunately passed away soon after. However, he was ordained as a minister in 1923 and was assigned to the AME Disney Chapel Church in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. The building still exists. In fact, I recently read where there's a fundraiser to try to renovate that building. He did remain at the Disney Chapel Church from 23 to 1928, at which time he was reassigned to the Highland AME Church in Amherst, Nova Scotia. The accounts that I've been able to find in the Amherst Daily News show that the membership of the church, the financial situation of the church, and in fact even the improvements of the church after he arrived there were extremely significant. Unfortunately, in 1931, he passed away from heart failure.
Thanks to the efforts of the No. 2 Construction Battalion and the combined efforts of all of our brave armed forces, personnel, and an endless sea of volunteers, the war to end all wars finally ended on November 11th, 1918, what we now know as Remembrance Day. But peace, true peace, much like the mud and the dust of the battlefields, never had a chance to settle. The Treaty of Versailles wrote ceasefire into law, but not into everyone's hearts. A broken, defeated, and humiliated Germany nursed its wounds with resentment. And out of the ashes of war rose a new kind of evil, one of which the world had never seen before. This evil had a name: blunt, bloody, and brutal beyond belief. Nazis.
Stop thinking and follow me, cried Hitler.
5 letters that will forever remind us of the disgusting depths of human history. Hitler didn't just want to lead. He wanted to conquer the world with his grotesque vision. On September 1st, 1939, Nazi tanks rolled triumphantly into Poland. The sky darkened. The earth shook. The world held its breath. Then, in Britain's darkest hour, one man stood steadfast in his stance against tyranny.
We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it was subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle.
Unshakable, unrelenting. His courage formed a shield against invasion and became a weapon that took aim at Nazi Germany. His voice became a lighthouse amidst a sea of dark fears as he fought for what we all believed in, the right to live in peace. Winston Churchill was not a perfect man, but he was the perfect man for that moment. Terrifyingly, history started repeating itself as once again war swept across Europe like a horrendous plague on our species. Back in Cumberland County, the letters started arriving again. The posters went up. The call to serve was sounded, and not just in the foothills and fields. This time, the front lines weren't only trenches and barbed wire. They were convoys, tanks, merchant ships, and civilian sailors. And while Britain faced the Blitz and Europe burned, young Canadians once again came to the rescue of their beloved Commonwealth. Now, it wasn't just soldiers marching into history. It was sailors, shipbuilders, and boys barely old enough to shave. Some were trained, some weren't. Some signed up. Some, like 15-year-old George Evans from St. John's, Newfoundland, saw a ship shaped like opportunity and quickly climbed aboard.
In 1941, my grandfather, George Evans, was living in St. John's, Newfoundland, and all the different ships, merchant marine ships, and I think there was a couple of destroyers came into the ports, and he got really excited about it, like most 15-year-olds probably would, and went checking out the ships, and somehow got in and realized they needed people, and they were looking for them, but he had to be older than 15. He had to, I think, be at least 16, and he didn't have the ID for it, but they said, you bring the ID back and this and that, and somehow he got on there without the ID and kind of hid on the boat and ended up going on the voyage. The first boat that he was on was the SS Ironvik. When they got about 450 miles off the coast of Greenland on their way to England, they got torpedoed by a U-boat.
Are you realizing at this point what you might be getting yourself into?
No, I didn't have a clue. I only heard that the U-boats were out around, but that didn't mean nothing to me at the time. Yeah, the excitement and so on, but it wasn't for a while. It was in the beginning there was excitement, but when you got into trouble there wasn't that excitement at all. This 5th of September 1945, at 3:30 in the morning, we heard this big bang inside the ship, and so one of the ABs on watch, he said, torpedo starboard side, torpedo starboard side. And I reaching up and got my life jacket up over my head, and the curtains come across my gun. And I had my clothing on. I didn't change my clothing or anything. I just laid on my bunk. I got my life jacket on and ran for the deck, and I tripped and fell down or something. So one of the ABs picked me up and brought me to the wrong lifeboat. I should have been in the port lifeboat, but I ended up in the starboard lifeboat. Sort of frightening because we didn't know what was going on, And when we got away from the ship, the Sparks gave out SOS. He was a Canadian chap, and he was about 18, I think, and he gave out SOS. And of course, the Germans picked up the SOS, and then the submarine had come to surface, and then started shelling the ship, and then put another torpedo in her. And one of the English guys said, it's better lose one man, lose a whole boat full. And the chief officer said, well, he said, we got to take a chance. He said, we can't lose a man. We want to see everybody saved, And of course, they argued over the matter, and it was getting so hot for us that they said, well, set fire to the after lifeboat, jolly boat was there. And so finally, we turned away because it was getting too hot for us, and we rode away from the ship. We got a little drop of water, and we had tin meatballs and gravy on board, and cigarettes, Bluebird cigarettes were called then. and we had ration to water, and we're always thirsty. And I don't think I said 2 words, you know. So I didn't know it was frozen like. I was just couldn't say nothing, you know. Or maybe, but it started to get cold and snowing and blowing and mountains at sea. I suppose it was the thing, anxious to live, you know. You didn't want to die. You didn't want to get killed. You didn't want to be taken prisoners of war. You wanted to, you know, survive and get home to see your brothers and sisters and mom and dad, you know.
He talked about that quite a bit over the years when we were children. He loved telling the stories, and it was quite traumatic for him, obviously, being on a life raft for 9 days and being 15 years old and with a bunch of other men, and they had, you know, very limited rations and water. And he didn't really ever show much fear when he told the stories, but he obviously, you know, that he complained about his feet bothering him so bad and just being scared to mess up or get in the way of anybody. And when he got back, he got into the customs, and he still important to him to be something similar to the military, with obviously not being overseas and doing that, and he wanted to have a family, so he got into customs, and that brought him to Amherst, and that's where he started his family and had my father and his brother and sister. He did a lot of traveling. He always had a little camper, and him and my grandmother would go visit other family members and stay, and he always went to Legions. He loved telling a story and hearing other stories, and that's pretty much what he did for all of his retirement. He was writing to the military, he was writing that book, and he was, you know, very involved in what was going on and what, like, any memories or stories or things that were happening from those days. And I believe he went to Russia at one point, and they gave him a Medal of Honor for bringing all the supplies in, and they were recognizing the Canadian soldiers for their effort with the Merchant Marines. My family and I are obviously very proud of what he did, to be so strong to make it through that and still come out and have a good career and stay with the government and raise a family and have lots of family stem from that. My grandfather's legacy was he was definitely strong and determined, and if he wanted to do something, he was doing it. And there was no fear stopping him from doing that. Fear never seemed to ever be an issue with my grandfather. He was definitely a strong, and very strong physically and strong-willed man. He loved Amherst. He didn't want to leave Amherst even when he did. He finally got to a point where he was still living on his own and had his little house that he built on Fletcher, and he was still going to Legion quite often and a member of his church, and was heavily involved in stuff, and just wasn't going to admit that he had to go into an old age home and wasn't going to leave Amherst. It took quite a bit of coaxing and bringing him back and forth and finding a place that he actually felt comfortable. And I think it wasn't until he found out there was a few other people that were in the Marines and stuff in the home that he got comfortable and started meeting some of the ladies. Well, the biggest part of his legacy is becoming a member of the Veteran Affairs and sharing his story and making sure everybody knew exactly what went on when this was all happening, and especially with the Merchant Marines and the supply lines and how important it was, and just how much they went through and how hard they got hit by the U-boats and stuff. He really wanted to let people know that story and just, you know, what they went through, and surviving it was such an ordeal. He ended up writing a book about it, and it's called Through the Corridors of Hell. And it starts out, he's pretty excited to be a part of all this, but then very quickly, he basically goes through the corridors of hell. You're getting fired at, and you're hearing the gunfire, and you're seeing boats getting sunk and people in the water, and all the horrors of war. Another part of his mission was, when he joined the Veteran Affairs, was to make sure that the Merchant Marines were recognized as well as all the other areas in the military and the Navy. Just he felt like they weren't really being recognized, and so he focused a lot of attention and fought really hard to make sure that his own servicemen and other men that were in the Merchant Marines got recognized as well. And due to his efforts with Veteran Affairs, he was able to get them recognized and acknowledged.
George Evans survived the unspeakable: torpedoes, fire, and freezing seas. His body was battered, but his spirit was unbroken. Fortunately for him and his family, he came to Amherst, Nova Scotia to start again, to enjoy a second chance at life. to make memories, and to create a legacy. But he did not leave the war behind. Because war never really ends for those who carry the memories of it inside them. Not all wounds of war are carved by bullets. Some are much deeper and painted in silence. Just down the road, another son of the Maritimes was also called to war. Not with a rifle, but with a paintbrush. A young artist, a newlywed, a blank canvas. Alex Colville. He was not tasked with pulling the trigger. He was tasked with capturing what the bombs and gunfire left behind for the rest of the world to see.
Well, like many of his generation, in 1942, right after graduating from Mount Allison University, taking the time to get married, next step was Alex Colville enlisted in the Canadian Armed Forces. He had graduated with an art degree, and his hope was to, or I should say his aspiration, was to be a Canadian war artist. It was a program that had been created by Lord Beaverbrook during World War I, and there was talk that it would be created again. In 1942, however, that hadn't happened, and Colville enlisted in an artillery regiment, and that was, he literally went from school, church for his wedding ceremony, boom, enlisted, off to the army. The first place that he went was actually Fredericton for training, then Camp Petawawa in Ontario, and he, in his first 2 years through which was all training, he went from being a private first class to a sergeant, and then was commissioned a second lieutenant when he got his orders to go to London. The way he worked is he was assigned a jeep and a driver, and he was in a certain section, and he would follow his nose to see what was going on. And he was rarely involved directly in combat. They tried to keep the war artists out of the direct line of fire, but he was, he saw a lot of things. He saw a lot. You can't control that. He came under fire. He came under artillery bombardment and mortars and so on. He certainly saw the results of it. They were brought back off the line to recuperate. Colville would document their day-to-day activities, but he also would go and be right on, up very close to the front lines, documenting, tank formation attacks, or documenting taking bridges, destroying infrastructure. And so a lot of his paintings, you see, he came across many dead bodies, saw people killed. I think like many veterans, he didn't really talk about it very much, but one thing that he did say that I think certainly shows how traumatic it was, is that he often felt that he should have felt more. But he said, it's seeing one dead body is horrific. Seeing 10 dead bodies is maybe it feels 10 times as bad. 500 dead bodies, your brain can't process it. You can't feel that much more. You become numb. It becomes a kind of commonplace. And how horrific a thing, right? That dead body after body, dead people after, all these, that becomes something you just sort of shut out of your mind. So that was, for him, I think he found that to be the most, the thing that changed him the most as a person. And I think it's the thing that marked him the most as an artist in his later career. I think probably the most iconic Soldier and Girl, the station, is set in the Sackville train station. He found coming back from the war that he didn't quite know what to paint. He spent a lot of time painting farm animals and bridges, and he found them to be very calming, but he didn't really feel that he was capturing what he wanted to do, and he actually was thinking of quitting painting and taking up architecture. I think, one of the things that, two strains on that I would say. One is that he showed the poignancy of it. He showed the humanity of it. There's a painting called Tragic Landscape that I think is one that really shows the cost of war. What you're looking at is a landscape with farmers' fields off to some barns and trees, and it looks, it's the traditional landscape painting, except the barns are bombed out, and in the very front of the foreground is a dead German paratrooper. So he's showing you this is what it was. There was bodies everywhere. The Germans, in the midst of battle, nobody had time to stop and bury the dead. And if you're pushed out of the area, and obviously as troops are advancing on fronts, the enemy dead are the last to get buried. Colville saw a lot of bodies that way, and he wanted to show that we're all human. This is, it's a painting of a dead teenager, right? It's very poignant. But the other thing that Colville did, and I think it's something that, because for most of us who have been lucky enough not to have to experience war, you don't realize, especially the kind of mechanized war that the Second World War was, and the First World War too. I mean, we only think of the fighting soldiers. We think of that as being what war was. But for the vast majority of Canadian service people, the war was actually it's like going to a job, right? They were making sure that the frontline soldiers had enough ammunition, enough food, that their tanks were running, that their trucks had tires, that the petrol was getting to them from the British camps. It was, for every, I'm not sure what the exact number is, but I know that for every fighting soldier there were 10 or 20 support staff. And that's a part of the war effort that was incredibly important. And in fact, that's something that Colville documented a lot. He was very interested in how things worked and had people who did their jobs well. Alex Colville, I think of as being I call him a conservative rebel, poster child for the greatest generation. He's someone that really is that. I thought of him as this conservative rebel who insists on building a better world.
Alex Colville returned home with eyes that had seen too much. His brush became a reflection of those memories, immortalizing not the glory of war, but the grief it leaves behind. He painted stillness. He painted silence. He painted pain, and he painted death. Because that's ultimately all war really creates. It doesn't just live in the trenches or in the minds of soldiers. It lingers in the homes they return to, and in the hearts of those they leave behind. Not all war stories are fought with guns and paintbrushes. Some are fought with unwanted goodbyes and waiting what feels like forever. Some battles are faced with a stiff upper lip and no choice but to keep calm and carry on. In the case of war brides, that often meant starting over in a place you've never seen, let alone been. For some, carrying love, pure innocence, and loss across the vast Atlantic Ocean. And that's where our final story begins, with a young Englishwoman named Doris Reindres, falling in love with a soldier from a small town in Canada called Amherst.
My mom, Doris Reindres, who was from England, she met my dad in Epsom, Surrey. My dad was from Amherst, Nova Scotia. He was in the Signal Corps, and she lived with her mom and sister, and across the park from her grandmother's tea room, there was a park. And so her and her best friend decided they would go for a walk in the park and saw these two good-looking Canadian chaps, and they noticed them too, so they ended up going. My mom and her friend were dancers at a dance club, and my dad ended up going there just about every night, and it wasn't long before they were engaged and married, and her mom used to call him Bobby Dazzler because he was a dazzler at that time. So he was stationed in East Grinstead, and so she decided to move there to be closer to him. And they got an apartment and lived together for a while. Of course, he wasn't around a lot because he was stationed going out in the war. That was 1941. And then in 1943, Mom and Dad were very much in love, and they were very young. And they loved to go out and to dance, which is really funny because in later years, my dad wasn't that good of a dancer. Anyway, she danced, and then when they were in East Grinstead, she got a job at a theater. Mom and her best friend Molly worked at the theater, the Whitehall Theater, cinema, I guess it's called in England, and they worked mainly nights, I believe. Dad and her used to go to the cinema when she wasn't working, and of course all his friends came to the cinema as well. July 9th, 1943, Mom and her friend Molly were working at the cinema, and Dad was not there at the time, and all of a sudden there was the German aircraft flew over and unloaded all their bombs on the cinema.
Troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile. While you've a Lucifer to light your fag, smile, boys, that's the style. What's the use of worrying? It never was worthwhile. So pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile. It's a long way to Tipperary. It's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly. Farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. Bless them all, bless them all, the long and the short and the tall. Bless all the sergeants and WO1s, bless all the corporals and their blinking sons, for we're saying goodbye to them all. As back to their barracks they crawl, you'll get no promotion this side of the ocean, so cheer up my lads, bless them all. With someone like you,
came just in the nick of time, didn't you, Mr. Cassidy? Cassidy, that's all I've been hearing ever since I joined the Bar 20.
And go and find a place that's known to God alone, just a spot to call our own. We'll find perfect peace where joys never cease, out there beneath the boiling sky.
and 108 were killed, and my mom was one of the injured, and of course Dad knew nothing about this. So he had to, heard about it, they all rushed to the cinema to help drag out the bodies, and Dad never knowing if one was going to be his wife. And at that time, she was 5 months pregnant with my sister, and a lot of people didn't really know this. My dad was frantic. Of course he was frantic, because every time he'd go in there to pull out he never knew if it was his wife, but a lot of them were his friends. And she was in the hospital for 6 weeks. Mom didn't really talk about it too much. I think Dad more or less talked about it a little bit more, because Mom was kind of not with it for 6 weeks. She was very injured. At that time, my dad decided he was sending her to Canada. He said, I want you to go meet my mom and dad and my sisters and brother. And so, it wasn't long, the bombing was in July, and he sent her to Canada in November. So it wasn't long. He shipped her back to Canada where it was safe. Well, the one good thing about all this was that my sister Sandy was fine. Everything was fine. She ended up having the baby in Canada, had the baby actually in my grandmother's house. She left England in November, I believe it was, on the Mauritania, and they arrived at Pier 21 in Halifax, where she boarded the train to go to Amherst, Nova Scotia, to be met by her new in-laws, and she left her mom and her sister, who she never saw again. She never saw her mom again. She did see her sister after 25 years, I think, of being in Canada. But when she got to the train station, there was my grandmother and grandfather there to meet her, and I guess they were quite welcoming. But I mean, it must have been so horrific, I would think. My father, Robert Reindress, was still overseas he never got back to Canada until 1945. So she was over here by herself, literally by herself, although she did meet a few war brides. They were from Scotland and Ireland and England, and some of them became very good friends, best friends. Mom loved music, and her favorite song of all times was, of course, White Cliffs of Dover. She could sing, man, she had a really good voice. And my brother, and she played steel guitar, and she played the mouth organ, so she's very musical. Basically, she was always loving and sweet. I don't think it really changed. She was just a nice, very nice person, and everybody loved her. I mean, every one of our friends called her Mom. I mean, at 1 o'clock in the morning, we'd come home and she'd get up and make us French fries. So, she was amazing. She was just kind and sweet to everybody. Just be kind, and this world today would not be a very happy world for her, because she just loved life so much. And the way things are, nobody's happy. I don't think too much about things. So, no, she just made the world a better place. That's all there is to it.
Unfortunately for those who lived through these awful years of torment and hell, that's not all there was to it. Because the effects of war don't end when politicians declare peace. It ends, if it ever ends at all, in whispers, in the shaking hands of broken men, in the tears of widows who still sleep on one side of the bed, in the silence of children raised by ghosts of what could have been. War is a thief that steals so much innocence, millions of futures, and decades of peace. The last bullet may be fired in battle, but its sound echoes through families and towns for generations to come. And it echoed here in Cumberland County, Nova Scotia, a community like so many others around the world who had war unwillingly thrust upon them. These stories were not all headline news or heavily featured in the history books, but they live on to this day in the faces, the footsteps, and the fractured lives of people affected by it. A soldier who came home with stories so heavy he had to write them down. A man who had to fight for the right to fight, and proved that great courage comes in all sizes and colors. A boy lost at sea who drifted through fire and frost and came home with a hell of a story to tell. A numb artist who didn't paint war to glorify it, but to represent its darkest truth to those who only heard the stories. And a war bride whose bravery wasn't just crossing oceans, but in building a new life from the rubble that tried to bury her. 2 wars, 5 people, 1 community. And now, you know their names. Will, Wilfred, George, Alex, and Doris. 5 individuals that share very similar stories with tens of millions of others all around the world. We honor, respect, and appreciate you all. So to every veteran who served, to every volunteer who supported, to every unsung hero who did what they needed to do, to every person who sacrificed so that we could all live in peace. Thank you. Although those words don't feel like enough, with grateful hearts we say it anyway. War is a wound that never fully heals, but from that darkness came light. From the trenches came writers. From injustice came warriors. From freezing waters came hope. From grief came art. From ruin came love. 5 voices, once faint, now echo in our hearts forever. Tied not by rank or regiment, but by resilience and roots planted deep in the soil of a small, hard-working Canadian community. A community that gave the world far more than it ever wanted to offer. Cumberland County may be small on a map, but through these stories, it has become a monument to the might of the human spirit. Let this film be a part of their legacy. That we honor the memories of all those who sacrificed for us by making the very most of the peace they earned for us. The question still remains: do we live in a way that truly honors their sacrifice? Will you walk away from this film unchanged? Or will you stand, like they did, for something far greater than yourself? To those who served, to those who waited, those who wept, and those who never made it home, we thank you, we honor you, we remember you.
There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see. We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day. Keep smiling through, just like you always do, till the blue skies drive the dark clouds far away. So won't you please say hello to the folks that I know, tell them I won't be long. They'll be happy to know that as you saw me go, I was singing this song. We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day. Yes, I know we'll meet again some sunny day. Amen. Oh, shoot. Cut that out.
I love that song too. Amazingly. Are you happy?
Are you? Are you? Sound okay?
I'm very happy. I can
Yeah.
hear just you guys through this, and it sounds fantastic.
It'll be kind of interesting to see what they do with the songs, if they'll put them in behind some of the skits.
Patrick.
Oh, you're doing it. Oh, yeah. Because when we did
We're
this,
talking about
when we
you like
did,
you're not here,
yeah,
right?
when we did the Remember show, we just had 3 segments.